Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the 23rd Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 31, also known as Proper 26, which this year falls on the 31st of October if you're not observing Reformation Sunday, which I understand probably not everyone will.
And we affirm and support all of those choices because we will also have, coming out right after this, a Reformation Day episode with special guest and scholar Pace Warfield-May.
Yay!
Woohoo!
We have one content notification for you this episode. We talk about colonization and genocide when discussing the first reading.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
Our deep dive for this episode is on religion and spirituality, in part because our first and gospel readings for today both feature the Shema, which is an ancient Jewish prayer that is extremely well known to Jewish people around the world. It's from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and the comparison I usually make is that the Shema is to Judaism as the Lord's Prayer is to Christianity, strictly in the sense that if you are even vaguely related with that religion, you are likely to at least be able to recognize this.
Yeah.
The vast majority of Christians recognize the Lord's Prayer even if they can't say it, and the Shema has a very similar relationship to Judaism. It is one of the best known pieces of liturgy, you might say.
Mm-hmm. And scripture.
Yes. So today we wanted to talk a bit about the similarities and differences between religion and spirituality, because both Judaism and Christianity are obviously religions. As you may have guessed, if you're listening to this podcast, you may have an interest in that sort of thing. And another common buzzword these days is spirituality, which doesn't always imply the same thing as religions do. And the general guideline that I use to differentiate between the two is that religion is community-oriented and spirituality is individual-oriented. Religion can involve individual things, individual actions and choices and lifestyles, and spirituality can lead you to community things, but that's not the direction they tend in, I guess.
Which I think is interesting, particularly given the ways kind of more conservative Christian evangelical circles emphasize like a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, and that sort of thing. And they emphasize that as like a religious doctrine, but it actually is so individualistic that it frequently...
You can totally be a evangelical Christian and not almost ever attend a church. That is completely a possibility.
Yeah, but it undermines the idea of Christianity as a religion in the sense of when it makes such an emphasis on individuality. But I think a lot of the time when we hear like I'm spiritual but not religious, that's not the context, because I think a lot of those people would still claim religion and claim Christianity.
I think a lot of these spiritual but not religious folks are saying that because they are freaked out by religion, in part because of some of those evangelical conservatives that...
Yeah, I think actually, like, when I think about conversations about spirituality and religion, I think similarly to UK that, right, there's an emphasis on individual relationship with something larger than yourself. And
sure, which you can find in any AA group.
You can. And you can find it with nature, right? Like there's lots of ways to find it, and communal stuff. And I think because of who I am, right? Like that's a false binary. You can in fact be both spiritual and religious. But I think also what needs to be brought into that conversation is, and we're kind of getting at it with spiritual people who are freaked out by conservative evangelical Christian church stuff, but also...
I mean, it's not like we aren't.
Right. Like, same.
Yeah.
Hard same. But also there's a real space that I think the even mainline and like moderate progressive Protestant denominations like the ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, of which we are a part, have not really gotten to or explored at all is folks who have been harmed by organized religion, by denominations and organizations, and individuals claiming Christianity as their reasoning.
There's the unchurched who are not part of the church, and then there's the dechurched who were and left.
Yep.
And that's two very different things.
Yes. Yeah, and I think I want to be careful in our conversation because you and I both have like cast our lot clearly with organized religion because we're pastors in the
That's where, I've gotten my health insurance on a fairly regular basis.
I mean, I don't know what I'm getting from it in this particular moment, but that is not like when we tease out these differences, it is not to say that everyone should be part of a denomination or a church or anything like that. There is a particular, I think, especially in the way that I understand Christianity, there is a clear call to be in community.
Yes.
And that doesn't, there's no call. I said this, my first call, I ended up preaching and presiding at the closing of a congregation. And one of the things I said in my sermon was, Jesus never said, go build a church, worship me, and everything will be fine. Jesus said, go baptize and teach, right? So the ways that we form communities of faith, especially right now, is shifting so significantly with the pandemic, with access to technology, with harm caused again and again and again by institutional church, that a lot of people, I think, are forming communities of faith virtually or in their friend groups. And there's like dangers with that, right? Of like-minded and just like breeding like-minded things. But there's also...
Or other dangers too.
Yeah, but there's also a gift of people who are committed to praying for each other and caring for each other and challenging each other and helping each other grow in their spirituality and in their faith.
Right. So I want to be clear. I'm not saying that either religion or spirituality is bad. Mm-hmm. Like, they both have their place. They both offer good things. My explanation for why I wound up choosing organized religion over, not, is that when it comes down to what if they go bad, I think that the term is a failure state. When that type of thing goes into its failure state, its most common flaws get amplified, that kind of thing. I can see and recognize the failure state of religions more easily than I can see and recognize the failure states of spirituality. And I am way more likely to say, okay, this is not a good place. I should leave now. And so it's safer for me, because the failure state for religion tends to be an unhealthy community. And gee, I've seen a lot of those. And the failure state for spirituality is, I believe the old-fashioned term for it is navel gazing, just being so inward focused that you don't notice the rest of the world anymore. And that's not what the connection to the divine is actually supposed to be about. I'm just saying. So,
but it's harder when you're not in community to realize that you're navel gazing.
Yes. And the problem that a lot of people seem to have with religion is the fact that religion means you have to put up with all those other people. And goodness knows I have had those days myself. But the thing is, those people are just as created by God as you are. And you're going to have to deal with that at some point. So while certainly taking some time off, renewing yourself, or certainly choosing your own community and choosing a healthy community that supports you and loves you and treats you properly, those are good things. You still have to acknowledge that the rest of the community exists, like on a existential level. And you're going to have to emotionally deal with that at some point.
Yeah. I do think there, in that space, there is like in theory, right? When religion is at its best and something happens, we are able as a community to hold each other accountable for the actions that have harmed someone, whether that someone is in the community or not in the community, whether those actions are done by one person or a group of people. Now, the reality is that most denominations at this point are so mired in institutionalism and in, like, because of the way that denominations grew, have like bloated, so grown too big for themselves, and now are at a like theology of scarcity levels of what do? We don't have enough money to sustain this. And so because of that, like they're less likely to hold problematic people accountable, and they're more likely to make decisions that marginalize already marginalized people.
But on the other hand, in the last, say, 20, 30 years, there has been remarkable work and improvement on the issues of boundaries, the work of Brene Brown, the Me Too movement, thank goodness for critical race theory, and so on. And so, on the one hand, yes, I want to acknowledge that all of those things you just said are absolutely true. And on the other hand, we have all of this hope, all of these useful tools that we didn't have 40 years ago. And I think that can help us a lot in the days to come.
Yeah. And I think that's where I've been thinking a lot about this, in particularly as someone with like 2 part-time calls, now no part-time call, and like thinking about the ways that we relate to each other and how, because I don't think denominations are going to last, but I wonder what it looks like for us to be more intentional about creating communities of faith and creating religion in that sense that is really intentional, instead of adding it in like denominations have been trying to do with the Me Too movement and with boundaries workshops, but to have at the core of new communities of faith intentional boundaries, intentional naming of values around justice, and to let that be the starting point instead of trying to like have them come in and fix the problematic stuff that has been there for so long already.
Yeah. Well, and I also want to point out that not all of the bureaucracy is bad either, because the useful thing about bureaucracy in many cases is that you have what I've always heard called rules written in blood, which is that these are rules that exist because of a specific incident or because of a variety of specific incidents. We learned that this was a thing that you shouldn't do, so stop touching the hot stove, Bob, because we told you not to. That kind of thing. And when you're a bureaucracy, when you're an institution, you usually have some time to build those up, and you discover, oh yes, these are like things that we have all learned, and we can learn from each other that these are rules that we should have, and this makes us healthier. And that, ultimately speaking, is supposed to be the goal of a bureaucracy or an institution, theoretically. Now, whether or not that actually happens is a completely different question. But I appreciate the value of accumulating those rules written in blood as a larger group so that we can learn from each other, because a lot of those rules have kept many of us safe, or at least they should have kept us safe, and at least they existed.
Yeah, and I think that's where like I think there are rules that it goes back to the idea of accountability, right? That we have built in, or we are creating systems of accountability. We're creating rules that are guidelines for how we can be in community together. And we talked about this some in our episode with Russell on the 10 Commandments, right? That the 10 Commandments are guidelines for community. And when I learned about them in seminary, these are the fences. And so like they're the limits of things, and everything else, like you're free to do what you want within not killing someone, not stealing from someone. But I think part of the problem, again, is the space of, can we change rules when they no longer serve a purpose? Or like one example that I experienced when I was in Iowa is when I was trying to get the ministry that I was doing recognized as a call. I tried to do it in Minnesota, and the synod there, their particular rules about what counts as a call and what doesn't meant that I didn't. And in southeastern Iowa, the rule was it has to be paid, and it has to be for sure 15 hours a week. I had 12 to 15 hours a week. And the origins of that, right, are that people were taking advantage, especially of women, to contract them for very few hours and not pay them enough, or contract them for very few hours but actually expect them to work full time and just not get paid for that. So like the origins are good, but what ended up happening is that, and has happened for other people, not just me, is that people who are called to part-time ministry aren't able to have those calls recognized. Even when, like, I didn't overwork. I worked my hours and I was really good about keeping within those hours. But because of the church, it wasn't going to be counted as a call. Now, we did some finagling and we decided to count some extra things as part of my work for the congregation, and we changed my rate of pay, so I still was making the same amount of money but doing more.
Okay.
But I don't know if the bishop would have been really happy if he knew that that's how we actually like figured it out. Right, but it was a way to get me, as someone who has trouble finding a call because I'm non-binary in the ELCA, to have a recognized call to ministry. And so that's the, like, when we get too institutional, then when we get too many rules written in blood that maybe should have just been written in pen or pencil, then, like, the institution is too big to be able to change and adapt. And that's where it, like, the breakdown again happens. And
to flip this to the other side of the coin, if you're going in the opposite direction and you're trying to start a community from scratch, there are a variety of people who have tried to do this, and my personal favorite is not quite the word, but the one I know the most about, just because I happen to have heard a lot of people's stories about this, is a lot of people want to create a small community of group-owned land where you can live with your friends and share things in common, and all take on your own chores that you happen to actually be good at, and make your lives easier. It's a great idea. A lot of people tried it. It turns out that if you don't sit down and work out the exact rules very, very specifically in advance, everyone is going to be miserable and angry by the end of it. And I know this because this has happened so many times, and I've heard a few of the stories, and yet people keep trying without ever asking, hey, I wonder if someone tried this before and maybe discovered that there were some, things that we could learn from this. And when it comes to creating a new faith community, that might not involve sharing land, sharing possessions, although, hey, Christianity gives you the total right to think about that as an option. But the thing about a faith community is that it's a place where we have an expectation of trust, an expectation of authentic relationships, and being able to feel safe there, because there's really no way to talk about your faith if none of that is true. And because of that, forming a faith community is often a lot harder, emotionally speaking, and takes a lot more exacting work than forming, say, a D&D group. As much fun as a D&D group is, and while a D&D group does require a certain amount of trust, I've heard some stories about not, fabulous GMs over the years too, but it's really not the same. So being able to learn from each other is important, and I think that's one of the failure states that spirituality can get into, because you tend to assume that, oh, I am the first person to have this wonderful idea, and forget to go looking for, oh, maybe other people have tried this too and I can learn something from them.
I think there's that space in spirituality too, right? If your spirituality is too individualistic, there was a bishop one time, and there are disagreements I have with, like, the larger implications of this, but who said, if your spirituality helps you to see God in nature, that's great. My religion helps me also see God in the homeless person sitting on the stoop and in the domestic violence shelters. And so that, for the way that he was talking about it, is when we get too individualistic in our spirituality, we, like you said, we navel gaze. We forget to look up, to look around, to pay attention to the needs of others, to be entangled in the quantum physics sense with the rest of the world, to be bound up together. And so then that gets problematic, because then we don't feel a responsibility to care for others. We don't feel a responsibility to love our neighbor in the same way.
Yeah. One way that I've seen that come up, I have a variety of friends who are in various aspects of the pagan Wicca magic universe, I guess. And there was an author in the late 90s who put out a bunch of books that were for sale in every single Barnes & Noble I ever stepped foot in, that were very pretty. And I mean that quite literally. Like, the covers were beautiful. They put a lot of work into the cover art. They put less work into the content. And they were all about individual magic practice and how you could, they were all aimed at women. They all had lovely, Celtic knot designs on them. And the author's name involved the words like silver or wolf or some. I'm not having any luck Googling it.
Not Star King. Okay.
No, they weren't fiction. They were like instructions on how to be a witch, basically. And they came in several different colors, and I'm sure they had different topics. And every single person who I knew and who I know today remembers those, thought they were terrible, and they were absolutely a cash grab. But so many people who I also knew back then bought them because they didn't know any better, because they didn't have the connections to people who had actually been doing this for a while and could recognize a cash grab when they saw one. And so they sold like hotcakes, and they didn't have any, as far as I remember, they didn't have anything particularly like bad or evil in them. They weren't, encouraging people in nasty directions, but they also just didn't have a lot of content and wouldn't really sustain you in any kind of way.
They weren't about community. They weren't about sustenance.
Right. They were about stay on your own and keep reading my books so that no one tells you not to buy my books anymore. And I periodically think about that because it remains one of my best examples for
dangers of individualism.
The dangers of spirituality and individualism. Yeah. But again, we're not here to say that either religion or spirituality is bad or wrong. They both just have different failure states.
And they both are important, right? It's important to have spirituality within religion and religion within spirituality, to the extent that when we talk about religion, we're talking about community and accountability.
Yes. And occasionally having to deal with people who, just come at this from a very different direction than you do. And that can help you think of things in a different way.
Yeah.
So the last thing that I wanted to bring up is that we have a fairly common understanding in American pop culture of the differences between a religion of sacrifice / suffering / fear versus a religion of love, right? We know what those two things look like. We've seen them in the real world. And there are people who lean more toward a religion of the hard slog and fear, and you have to be scared of God and that kind of thing, versus the people who lean toward a religion of love. And the truth is that religion ultimately needs to be able to deal with suffering and love at the same time. But what we don't always recognize is that spirituality actually has those same tendencies as well. There are people who have a spirituality that leans firmly in the direction of love, and that's great, but they might have a little more trouble dealing with suffering when it comes along. Or there are people who honestly have a spirituality that is based on fear and suffering and sacrifice. And that's usually a sign that someone needs therapy. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
But those people exist too, and I have had some really odd conversations with them. And so we need to recognize that very often religion and spirituality will have the same tendencies and will lead us in very similar directions. And if we can't recognize that, then we're not going to be able to fix the problems of either of them.
And that a lot of that, I thought of this while you were talking about the spirituality aspect of sacrifice, suffering, and fear, but a lot of that also is born out of trauma and oppression and in response to that.
Yes.
And some of it, like you said, right, some of it is because they haven't dealt with it. They haven't been able to deal with it, right? Because mental health access.
Or they haven't been faced with it.
But mental health access is so inaccessible. So caveat there.
Yeah. But, well, no, I mean, it's just some of the people I've known who lean the hardest towards spirituality are the people who have always had money, have always had healthcare, have always had supportive family, have never faced any actual struggles whatsoever. And so they don't need religion because they don't need a community because they're good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the piece that I was specifically talking about that relates, I think, most to people who have experienced trauma and oppression, is if that's not dealt with, we can be so gaslit into thinking that that's just how it should be. The socialization.
That's how cults work.
The socialization that dictates that harm and suffering is God's will is so bad and so harmful.
And it sticks with you for so long.
Because especially when you don't have a community of accountability that can say no. I have some friends who have been pretty gaslit lately by particular things in their lives, and having that community of faith around them to say, oh, that was really bad, helps de-gaslight themselves, right? It helps them realize what was happening.
The same way that can happen when you finally, hopefully finish high school, get out of your hometown and describe your childhood stories to other people, and suddenly you realize, oh, that wasn't normal. My parents really were terrible to me. Okay. I had several friends in college who were going through that process.
Yeah.
So.
I just finished reading the book Monday's Not Coming by Tiffany D. Jackson, and there's part of that in there that's like, there's gaslighting and people who believe and don't believe the main character, but also this like two separate worlds that the main character and her best friend were living in, that there was no concept that the other one could be living the reality that they were living in, one of which is abusive. So like, content notification for this book, it gets pretty intense.
Yeah.
But that, like, it just like was such a foreign concept that like, why would this, like, how could this other person be living this way? Or how could, you mean not everybody lives the same way that I do? That sort of a thing. And and it's within the community that there's a little bit of space to try to find different ways of doing things.
Sure.
Our first reading for this episode is Deuteronomy 6:1-9. This passage introduces the Shema, which is the Hebrew word for to hear, but also refers to verses 4-5, beginning, Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. For Jewish people, this is the most commonly memorized passage in Scripture, often called the greatest commandment. So one of the themes in this that I picked up in this passage is the idea of a motto, right? Because as Kay said in the beginning, the Shema is the most common and like most prioritized memorizing type of phrase. And so I was thinking of different mottos, and I was having trouble coming up with mottos. Like, I know there's one in Leverage that's like the thing they say right before they go do the job, but I don't remember.
Let's go steal a blank.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah.
So I couldn't think of that. And then I came across something and Tim Allen was on it, and I was like, Home Improvement. I used to love Home Improvement growing up. And so,
oh goodness, childhood flashbacks I did not expect to have today.
And so the show, within the show in Home Improvement, is tool time, and the like motto thing, the thing that they say a bunch is, does everybody know what time it is? And then the whole audience goes, tool time. And it's dorky and adorable, and
which is exactly what you'd expect from a locally made TV show. Like, that is exactly the quality level that they should have been going for, and I love how well they nailed that. Wow, that was an unintentional pun. Okay.
Disclaimer, I imagine that Home Improvement did not particularly age well, especially around sexism, but I have no idea, so that's how I like it.
I remember really loving the mom. Jill was awesome. It also helped that she shared her name with my mom, but my mom is also named Jill. I remember her getting a few crowning moments of awesome, as TV tropes would put it, and that was pretty fabulous.
She was pretty great. I liked her. Mm-hmm. And then in verse 1 we read, Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the ordinances that the becoming one your God charged me to teach you to observe in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy. I was thinking about occupying lands, and first off, it's really complicated because, in fact, there were already people living in these lands. So when we think of colonization and colonialism, that is what this was.
Yeah.
So I'm not advocating or supporting any of that, but I was thinking about the other ways that like places are occupied besides white settler violence. And in the TV show The Expanse, there's like the protomolecule creates this like ring, and through the ring are all these other potentially inhabitable worlds. And one of them, Illis, the like crew of the Rocinante goes to Illis to help figure out what's going on there and try to kind of smooth things over, because the Belters, the people who had been living on in the asteroid belt, had moved there and had been mining resources that were really important that they could potentially sell to make enough money to get out of poverty, which is what they were in. And then scientists on an official expedition from Earth were coming with the military And that was like this weird thing because the proto-molecule was already there, but that was like the first one who had come in and kind of taken over but was dormant. And then the Belters came in and they were kind of leaving the proto-molecule alone, but also mining for resources, which is what we do in colonization. And then the scientists and military came in and they were going to take over the Belters and like kick the Belters off. It's just like this whole complicated thing. And they didn't have like really clear statutes and ordinances, but the like idea of occupying new lands, that's what humans do so much, and it's so harmful to so many people, especially right now because literally people already live everywhere. So like you're harming people when you go to move into their lands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in verse 2, we read, "So that you and your children and your children's children may fear the Lord your God all the days of your life, and keep all God's decrees and God's commandments that I am commanding you, so that your days may be long." And this reminds me a bit of the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov, who, interestingly enough, was culturally and possibly religiously Jewish. I'm not sure if he was observant or not, but he was Jewish. And I kind of wonder if he intentionally mirrored this in his Foundation series, in which a character named Harry Seldon set up the Foundation, a group of people, to maintain and continue the galaxy's scientific progress when he realized that the galactic empire that he lived in was collapsing because he had used something that he called psychosocial history, if I'm remembering that right, to calculate that 1,000 years after the fall of that galactic empire, another empire could rise and stabilize the galaxy again, and then allow for the continued progress. Is the basic foundation of the series. That was also unintentional. I kind of wonder if this whole idea of remembering so that your days may be long and your children and your children's children should also remember this may have played some part in creating the baseline for that series. So
interesting. I feel like I recently read a short story with a similar, like, the people who actually, like, it was a time warp kind of thing that seemed like people from Earth were actually the ones who started the thing, and then like their descendants went to Earth and were like, hey, there's this thing, danger, danger. And so people left to go investigate. And so it's like this loop because of like how the time warp happens that like they go back in time. I don't know what it is exactly, but
interesting. Okay.
I wish I could remember.
And then in verse 7, we read, "Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise." And this verse reminds me of the story of Rabbi Herzog. And after World War II, there were a number of Jewish children who had been taken in by Christian orphanages. Now, some of them were orphans to start with, and some of them had been sent there by their parents to keep them safe while their parents tried to escape the Holocaust. And Rabbi Herzog would arrive at these orphanages and ask to take the Jewish children back to reconnect them with their families, and no matter how distantly related they had to be connected. And generally what would happen is that the people at these orphanages would say, well, yes, of course, we're happy to have you take them, but the thing is, we didn't keep records because we didn't know whether the Nazis were going to actually get here, or maybe the Nazis actually had been there. And so it wasn't safe for us to keep records of which child was Jewish and which child wasn't. And so we don't actually know anymore, because it's been, 6 years or longer, which of these kids should go with you and which shouldn't. And Rabbi Herzog would say, don't worry about it, just gather all the children together in one place and I'll be able to figure it out. And then he would go up after the children had gathered in one place, and he would stand in front of them and he would start reciting the Shema. And every time that there were Jewish children in that orphanage, some of the kids would start crying and yelling mama or papa because they remembered their parents saying the Shema over them as when they were younger. And run toward him, and then he would know that those were the Jewish children. I'm not saying it was 100% effective, but apparently it was very effective. And so you can read this story on a website that we can put on our
we'll include it in the
episode description. And I've heard that a number of different places, so I'm sure there's also plenty of other articles about it around the internet.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I know someone whose last name was De Jesus, and what they had said is that a lot of orphanages, that was the last name given to kids in Christian orphanages in like Spain. And so that was also
Oh,
Yeah,
Jesus.
that was
Sure.
also an indicator, though, that there was a high likelihood that they were Jewish because so many Jewish people were doing exactly what you said and putting kids in
Right.
orphanages to keep them safe. So that's also like an interesting like way and a much more problematic way of doing it, right? Where it's like you're making them Christian. And that's where I thought you were going. And I was like, is this like the Indian Child Welfare Act again, but in another country?
Yeah, no, in the account that we're linking to, it does say that sometimes there did need to be money involved,
Mm-hmm.
although it was implied that the money was to transport the kids back to wherever it was that they were going to get the kids back. But most of the places where Rabbi Herzog went, and I don't think it was just him, it's just he was the one who became known for it because he did a lot of this. Most of the places that he went, they wanted to give him the Jewish children, they just didn't know how to figure that out because they couldn't keep record.
Yeah. But that is like, I wonder how much the Germans and the Hitlers, like people actually tried to get kids from orphanages because, right, like holocausts happen in many different ways and cultural holocausts are real. And so, like,
right.
in North America, what is known as North America right now, like there's a reckoning of kids who were taken to boarding schools, or like when we think about the Indian Child Welfare Act, part of it is to not place Native kids with white families when they have to be in foster care or that sort of a situation, so that they don't get completely disconnected from their own culture, because that is part of eliminating the culture, and that is actually genocide, even though we don't talk about it the same ways. So making Jewish kids grow up Christian is cultural genocide. But yeah, I'm glad that story was better than I thought it was.
Yeah.
When I was reading it, and I read the next verse, verse 8, it reads, "Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead." And I'm pretty sure they don't mean tattoos, because there are places where they discourage tattoos. But I know for me, the tattoos that I have, so the tattoo on my wrist that is my hands open in the shape of a cross, both to receive communion and to remind me of the crucifixion, and the ichthus, the rainbow ichthus that I have on my foot and ankle, have those deep meanings and are ways that I have bound my faith on my hand and on my foot. Don't know that I'll ever do it on my forehead, but I do like thinking about the new and different ways that we do bind our faith to us and ourselves to our faith. And I imagine some people like eventually, change faiths, convert, or get disenchanted, or whatever. And there's a complicated nature of having a Christian tattoo and no longer being Christian or something. But and some people keep it as a reminder of where they've been, and some people don't. But
that was why I wore my high school ring for several years. I got through that, therefore I can get through.
I wore my name tag from camp for a couple of years.
Our second reading for this episode is from Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 through 14. The author reminds us that unlike the regularly made sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem or in other religious traditions, sacrifices are unnecessary for Christians because Jesus' sacrifice lasts forever, instead of needing to be renewed.
So one of the themes in this passage is blood sacrifice. And my immediate thought was the book series Children of Blood and Bones, which I actually have not ever read, and from what I can gather, it's not actually about blood sacrifice at all. But I really do want to read it, and I've heard great things about the book. So if you're looking for a new book series, feel free to pick that one. But I also was thinking about vampires and the Twilight books. A whole other kind of ridiculousness, not of me not having read the books, but I have actually read the books, and they need blood to survive and to sustain themselves. And so what does that look like to require blood, and whose blood, what kind of blood and whose? We don't need to be vampires, nor are any other religious traditions. Not saying any other religious traditions are, but that's the only one that I could come up with that is nerdy and a blood sacrifice.
I mean, you brought up child sacrifice on the show before, and you have several dystopias for that. That's but true. We don't have to go there either.
And then in verse 11 we read, "But when Christ came as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, also that greater and perfect tent is not the big tent from the Great British Bake Off, nor is it the tents that Arthur Weasley borrows from his co-worker Perkins for the World Quidditch Cup, nor the ones that then are stolen by Hermione, Ron, and Harry when they go off on their adventure to find all the Horcruxes. Not that kind of tint, a different kind, just in case you were confused.
Yes, but that was kind of intense of you.
Okay, coming in with all the puns today. Well played.
I was actually waiting for a couple of minutes to figure out where I could use that, but yeah. Yes. Although I suppose Beth Wartick would ask, were they made with feet instead of being made with hands?
It's possible.
They could be. In verse 13, we read, "For if the blood of goats and bulls, with the sprinkling of the ashes of a heifer, sanctifies those who have been defiled, so that their flesh is purified." Okay, so before anyone freaks out at being sprinkled with blood and ashes to be purified, I would like to remind you that this podcast is centered on a religion that involves drinking blood on a regular basis, and, for many of us, being marked with ashes once a year. So there is a tweet going around of "explain your job badly" that I saw last night, and my answer involved giving people the choice, because choices are good, between alcoholic and non-alcoholic blood to drink.
I saw a similar tweet that was, "explain your job in the most creepy way possible."
That actually might have been the one I saw.
Which makes me
yeah,
then think of
like
Horror Nerds at Church and our guest for our Reformation
pretty much.
episode, Pace Warfield May, and wondering how we might describe it as creepily as possible, though your choice between alcoholic and non-alcoholic blood to drink is pretty solid. And then I was looking at the first half of verse 14, where we read, "How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God." And I was thinking about that offering for the sake of the whole, and it reminded me of The Matrix in the third movie, where Neo offers himself up to sustain the Matrix and protect everyone inside and free everyone else who is stuck inside it, to create their own world and their own ways of being in the world.
Yeah. And then in the second half of verse 14, we read, "Purify our conscience from dead works to worship the living God." So dead works in this verse are things that you've done that might appear good to an outside observer, but you did them for terrible reasons. Such as, for example, an episode of Leverage that involves a developer deciding to build Bibletopia, a Christian shopping complex, which on the face of it might not sound like a terrible idea, but actually it turns out that the reason why he wanted to build Bibletopia on that particular piece of land is that he was originally intending to build a perfectly normal, regular old non-Christian shopping complex there. And then there started to be a bunch of protests against him bulldozing the church that was already on that land in order to build the shopping complex. And so then he had an epiphany and decided to make it Bibletopia, and that way he still gets to profit, and also the PR is going to be better. And they can, as he puts it, keep some of the stained glass as decoration, and maybe put some of the pews in one of the seating areas, that kind of thing. And this being Leverage, thankfully, not to completely ruin the suspense for you, but the plan does not actually work out. So,
yeah, that sounds horrible.
Yeah.
And then our gospel for this episode is Mark chapter 12, verses 28 through 34. A scribe approaches Jesus to ask which of God's commandments is most important. When Jesus easily responds with the Shema and the Golden Rule, the scribe enthusiastically agrees, and Jesus says he is not far from the reign of God. So one theme in this is the Golden Rule, which I think it's lifted up a lot, and that's one of the ones that people are like, the Golden Rule, that exists in lots of different religions. So the Golden Rule is do to others as you would have them do unto you, right? Do to others as they would as you would have them do to you. But my preference is actually for the Platinum Rule, which is do to others as they would have you do to them. And I can't find it anymore, but a while ago they did a thing that was like, I think it took place in the UK, but it was getting people from various countries on the continent of Africa to suggest solutions to problems that people identified in the UK. And their suggestions of problems naturally made things worse because they didn't understand the culture. And it was the point of it was to criticize how white Westerners go into particularly countries on the continent of Africa and say, oh, this is your problem, let me solve it for you. And it's not actually helpful because they don't understand the culture. So the platinum rule switches that. So it's not do something that you would want, but do something that they actually would want themselves, which I really like.
I will get to a further discussion of the golden rule in just a minute.
That's fair. And then in verse 30, as we dive into the verses, we read, you shall love the becoming one, your God, with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And as we know, because we just read Deuteronomy, the and with all your strength is an addition by Jesus. And so my question for you, Kay, is did Jesus just add in the and with all your strength so that Hulk felt included?
I think that is absolutely an option, but I would also like to point out that this is the same Jesus who, upon getting angry with the money changers at the temple, went and braided his own whip and then chased him out with his own whip. And so I think he has some strength of his own. Like maybe he was referencing that story or something similar to that. He did spend a few years as a carpenter.
That's true. So, use your own strength for the good of God.
Yeah, sure. And verse 31 is the second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which is, of course, the golden rule, or another spin on the golden rule. There are a lot of those, and not all of them actually mean the same thing, but that's not quite where I'm going today. I wanted to explain that the way that I was taught the golden rule when I was a child was that by treating another person as you would want them to treat you, you are not necessarily going by the small-minded, very specific definition of that, but a broader one. Like, for example, let's say that I don't like football, but that I have someone on my Christmas gift list who loves football. This person would almost certainly be my father. So if I was going to treat him as I would want to be treated, I would not give my dad something related to football. But actually, my dad and I are different people.
No.
And I am, an adult capable of recognizing this. And the truth is that ultimately speaking, I would like to be given things that I like, and therefore to treat other people that same way, I would like to give other people things that they like. So me giving my dad something that is related to football would be treating him according to the golden rule, a slightly broader definition, which is what I was raised with. And I think I actually like this definition of the golden rule better than the platinum rule because I am a different person than those other people, and often that means I do actually want to treat them a little differently than they would treat themselves.
Yeah, that's the one critique about the platinum rule is like the number of people in my life that would rather, especially twos on the Enneagram, that would rather like be kind to everyone else but not necessarily to themselves.
Yes, well, or I was immediately thinking of the number of abusive relationships that I've heard of that basically take that and twist it in horrible ways.
Yeah.
But it's a lot harder to twist the golden rule that way, or at least it's always felt that way to me. But or at least once you've had some therapy and you've worked on some of your issues, it's a lot harder to.
Yeah.
So
I do like that this version of it is love your neighbor as yourself. The part that I always, for a while, I guess, maybe since college, have keyed in on is that it requires you also love yourself.
Yeah, and not everyone does. And some people learn how to love other people before they learn how to love themselves, and that's not necessarily terrible either. Like, please get there eventually.
That's the point of loving yourself, but that's hard to do sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes it's easier to love other people. So the golden rule is a little complicated, but that's okay because, we've had thousands of years to talk about it. And then in verse 33, we read, and to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding and with all the strength. So when the scribe rephrases what Jesus just said, he skips a step. Jesus says heart, soul, mind, and strength, but the scribe seems to skip soul. He only does heart, understanding, and strength, which I assume that understanding is mind. And that made me wonder, what does it mean to love someone with your whole soul? Like, specifically soul, what is that? Like, I can imagine loving someone with my heart or with my mind or with my strength in very concrete ways, but loving someone with my soul is a lot more difficult to picture. And honestly, the first thing that came to me was Aziraphale and Crowley in Good Omens, because they actually, I think they would argue over whether or not they had souls, but as heavenly and demonic beings, respectively, they have a very firm understanding of the importance of the soul in general, and definitely come to have some fondness for each other. Although the exact amount of that has not quite been entirely nailed down yet. So, although the second series is coming up, so we'll find out.
When we read verse 34, we read, "When Jesus saw that the scribe answered wisely, Jesus said to the scribe, 'You are not far off from the reign of God.'" After that, no one dared to ask Jesus any question. And I was thinking about Moana, and in the movie Moana, at the beginning, especially of the movie, Moana is not far off from the reign of her people as chief, right? She's being raised up as chief, but she's also not far off from the truth of her people, because the sea keeps calling to her and pulling her towards it. And I think that's like that space of like, you are not far from the reign of God, but like, which part are you not far from? Are you not far from the ruling aspect of it, the truth of it, the love of it? You could even go back to the heart, soul, mind, strength, right? Which parts are you, which parts are key and which parts are missing?
Sure. Absolutely. So thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for All Saints' Day with our special guest sister Colleen O'Toole. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcast. And just a note, because I just realized this, our Reformation Day episode is already out. So if you're up for Reformation Day, make sure you check the episode. It should be the episode right before this. If you want access to our full guest episodes and interviews, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. So if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christian said, Pax vobiscum.